Our next speaker came the furthest by far. Scotland, St. Andrews, University of St. Andrews. And that's Dr. Stephen Buckland. Steve earned his Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from the University of Southampton, then went on to get a Master's of Science in Statistics from the University of Edinburgh, and finally a PhD in Statistics from the University of Aberdeen. He started his career as a lecturer in statistics at the University of Aberdeen, where he spent quite a few years, before transitioning to a senior scientist where he came to the US in San Diego area to the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission based at Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego. Quite a contrast in weather from Scotland to San Diego. Yeah. Mostly summer. There he was involved in estimating trends in dolphin abundance in the eastern tropical Pacific. This was done to assess the impacts of the tuna fisheries on dolphin stocks. Steve then accepted the post of statistician with the Scottish Agricultural Statistics Service, now the Biomathematics and Statistics of Scotland. In 1993, he was appointed professor of statistics at the University of St. Andrews, where he has been until his retirement this year. At University of St. Andrews, he formed some significant units. One was the Center for Research into Ecological and Environmental Modeling. Many of you may know of it as CREAM, C-R-E-E-M. He was director there for 2 5-year stints. He also co-founded the National Center for Statistical Ecology with Byron Morgan at the University of Kent and Steve Brooks, then at the University of Cambridge. And he was its director or co-director until 2019. Some of you may recognize those names. Those are some pretty big statisticians. Steve Brooks was the grad student of Byron, is that correct? Yeah. I happened to take a capture Bayesian course at University of Cambridge when Ruth was the hotshot programmer, I guess I'd say, who was there. Quite interesting, brilliant guy. Which, as an aside, we were there at the, God, what's it called? But the college that Newton was at, and going across the courtyard out there was Stephen Hawking's in his wheelchair, and we're all just, that's Stephen Hawking's way out there, you know. He has a pretty fast little motoring along out there. Among his many awards, and he has many, he was named a Fellow of the International Statistical Institute and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And there aren't many of these. And in 2019, Dr. Buckland was awarded the Royal Statistical Society's Guy Medal with the color gold. This is a Lifetime Achievement Award given to a Fellow of the Society judged to have merited distinction by innovative contributions to the theory or application of statistics. He retains an interest in statistical ecology issues, especially related to modeling population dynamics, wildlife resource management, wildlife population assessment, distance sampling, and biodiversity modeling. Something I didn't know about Steve is that he has a keen interest in wildlife photography, and he became a photographer in residence at Tensmuir National Nature Preserve, which is just north of University of St. Andrews in 2018. He's an author or co-author on numerous books, but a lot of distance sampling books, and many of you have probably read his works. That connected him with David Anderson. The Center for Research in Ecological and Environmental Monitor that he directed has been the keeper and the version enhancer of distance. So every time you download a new version, it's that group that keeps up with it. I think they let Lake still play around with them every once in a while. No, they don't. But it is the state of the art. God, it has gone beyond whatever simple line transect and point transect and GIS, and he's going to talk some about that. He's going to talk about distance sampling and international collaboration. Dr. Buckland.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ken. When I received the invitation to come here, I was very much in two minds. I hadn't flown since COVID, and Eric Rekstad spoke with me, and he persuaded me I must come. After all, it might be my last chance to meet many of the people here that I know. And so he persuaded me, and then I discovered he wasn't coming. But I'm glad he did persuade me. Okay, I'm going to just briefly cover some of the history of distance sampling. And I think the term distance sampling, that was David's suggestion. Is that right, Ken?
He did his master's degree on line transit, using line transit sampling, the estimated abundance of nesting waterfowl.
Yes, but the term distance sampling came quite a bit later. And I think with our first book together, that was the title of it. And I think it was David who had suggested that title. But my memory is faulty, as you'll find out in a moment, so I may be wrong on that. So I guess the start of distance sampling was strip transits back in 1906 by Gross. And later came the Kelker strip, which is also strip transits, but he added the innovation of recording locations of animals so you could choose the width of the strip depending on what your data suggested. And of course, the key advance there, looking back on it, was not so much the choosing the width of the strip from the data, but the fact of collecting the positional data that allowed you to get into line transit sampling. The first, I think, derived model for line transit data was Hain in 1949. He had a concept of a flushing circle, and his idea was that as soon as you entered a grouse's flushing circle, it would flush. Later, hazard rate modelling indicated that that wasn't really a good basis for developing a model. Oops, getting carried away here. Similarly, Gates in 1968 came up with the first fully developed model for perpendicular distance data from transits. And that too, as hazard rate modelling suggests, is not actually a plausible model for the detection function that we use in distance sampling. You don't expect the detection function to start falling rapidly straight away. And so those two early models have been largely discredited. In the same year, 1968, Eberhardt came up with a conceptual paper with families of parametric curves. And this was starting to develop more useful models for the detection function. And then David Anderson came in, and as Ken said, working with duck nest data, surveys of duck nests, with an intuitive development of a non-parametric approach to line transit sampling. As others have said, David was very good at getting the right people around him. And one of those right people was Ken, where the key formulation underlying line transit sampling was developed. And someone else has also commented that David Anderson was good at when the methodology was out there. Now make it accessible to the user community. And so this is essentially the foundation of distance sampling. And again, he brought in a very competent helper in Jeff, and this monograph was for me a Bible. It really tackled a whole range of areas that had to be developed for the subject to move on. How did I first meet David? This is where my memory gets faulty. Well, first of all, I did a master's at Edinburgh, as Ken mentioned, back in 1976 to 77. And my dissertation for that master's was on mark recapture. But I never worked with David on mark recapture. So why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because a fellow student on that master's, Richard Hayes, did a review of line transit sampling for his dissertation. He then moved into medical statistics, and he didn't have time to develop the work he did there. And he asked me if I'd take what he had done and turn it into a publication. And that was the publication, the development of hazard rate modeling of the detection process, which is what demonstrates that the flaw in the Haynes model, and also the fact that the Gates negative exponential model is probably not going to work well for distance sampling. That got me interested in distance sampling, and followed that with a paper in 1985 on models for line transit sampling. And by this point, I was finding Ken Burnham very useful sounding board. And I'd been interacting with him for a bit at this time. And then when I was invited for an interview at the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, I'd mentioned this to Ken, and he said, well, call in North Carolina to meet up. And so I went to California via North Carolina. And as I say, my memory's faulty, because when I wrote this, I had the idea that I met David first then as well, but it actually was a bit later. And at that stage, I'd never been outside of Britain until March 1985, when I had a very brief meeting in Paris. So I came to North Carolina, and it was culture shock. I remember the first morning I was in North Carolina, and I went for breakfast. And they asked how I wanted my eggs. And I said, what are the options? And the combination of the rapid delivery, the accent, and the unfamiliar terminology, there was a whole list of things. The only one I understood was the one I had, sunny side up. And following that meeting, and following my move to California later that year, I actively started to engage with, well, continuing with Ken, but also with David, and also with Jeff. Jeff, at the time, was in San Diego, so I met up with him there. And we started working towards developing software for distance sampling. And Jeff took the code I developed for my 1985 paper and worked it in with code he had for the first incarnation of the distance software, MS-DOS version. And Jeff was very kind not to criticize my programming skills. Well, yeah, it was unlike Len. Len is always critical of my programming skills, but then I feel a bit better about it because he's equally critical of Jeff's programming skills. The first version of the software came out in 1992. And in the same year, I think, was the first year that I contributed to a workshop with David and Ken here. And we also were working on a book that was called Distance Sampling. It appeared the next year in 1993. And that was the first of 3 books that I worked with David on, all on distance sampling. David's relationship with hypothesis testing. It was a love-hate relationship. The love came earlier on, and like so many relationships, it didn't survive. I remember one day David talking about using AIC to select adjustment terms sequentially in a detection function model. And I commented that that's exactly equivalent to doing a likelihood ratio test with a p-value of 0.157. I think David said, "Is that right?" I got a rather stony-faced look. In 1998, I recruited Len Thomas to take the software that Jeff had developed and develop a Windows-based version of the distance software. In the first meeting we had after I'd recruited him with David and Ken, Len came too, so he was a bit in awe of this character. Difficult imagining now that Len could be in awe of anyone. But then David started what I could describe as a rant about a National Park Service report that had quite a lot about hypothesis testing and power functions and so on. And he was being very dismissive of it. The report was this one. Well, Len's never been a shrinking violet, and he admitted to the authorship of it. And it didn't stop us working together towards further publications, also on workshops. And if I had to name what the biggest influence was of David on my career, well, I think there are 2. One is how to teach workshops. And I didn't appreciate how much I'd learned from him until we started running workshops at St. Andrews by other people as well as ourselves. And the feedback at the ends of these workshops, the ones that were done in a David style, was so much better than any of the feedback we got on any of the other workshops. The other influence was the importance of, first of all, getting the methodology accepted in the scientific community through peer-reviewed journal publications. Secondly, creating user-friendly software. Thirdly, publishing again, but now in a more accessible format to the user community. And fourthly, offer these training workshops so that people can interact with you and understand the methods better. Okay, in the time I've got left, I'm going to just go through what has sprouted from that foundation of the 1980 monograph. Some of which I'm sure David had envisaged, and some that he probably had never dreamt of. Mark recapture distance sampling. Standard distance sampling, you assume you detect everything along the track line. That's not always the case, for example, with dolphin or whale surveys. So you can combine mark recapture with distance sampling to allow that probability on the track line to drop below 1. Indirect surveys. So if you really can't survey reliably the population of interest, maybe you can survey reliably something they produce, like dung or nests. In the case of nests is typically for ape surveys. And that introduces new elements because you need to estimate the deposition rate or nest building rate, and you also need to estimate the disappearance rate. Q counting. Sometimes it's much better to be able to treat an individual call of a bird as the recording unit rather than the bird itself. There are advantages to doing that, which I'll come to later. Trapping webs, and this was one very much David's baby, where you have a web of traps around a point or a number of traps along a line transect. It was a nice idea which had two problems with it. One is, with trapping web, you've got a lot of traps per point. And if you want to draw inference on a wider population, you need a lot of points. So that's a lot of work. The second is, the theory was put the traps closer together near the point, so you're sure to detect animals near the point. But you rely on the animals to move to find the traps. And if the animals are moving around, they're much more likely to encounter a trap near the point than further away. So your distances get biased towards 0. So those methods haven't taken off to the extent that might have been expected. What you can do is so-called trapping point transect, where you have just a single trap at each point, right at the point. Of course, then you need a method to determine how far in do animals come to encounter the trap. So it forces you to have trials. We developed this with key largo wood rats, which they didn't at the time have a method to estimate the abundance of. And so some of those wood rats were trapped and radio tagged. And then when you could track where the animal was, you'd open a trap at a known distance from the animal and record whether you trapped it or not. This worked well, although the postgrad we had working on this got a shock one day. She was following the radio signal of one of these rats that for some reason wasn't moving around very much. She knew she was near it, but she couldn't find it. She tripped over and came face to face with a Burmese python, which had swallowed the wood rat. It was the first time this introduced problem species had been found on Key Largo. Lure point transect's very similar. We developed this for surveys of the only endemic bird of the British Isles, the Scottish crossbill. and they respond to alarm calls. So you play an alarm call and record what birds come in. And again, you set up trials to estimate the detection function. The advantage of estimating detection function through those trials is you don't have to assume certain detection at the point, because you get the failures to detect in those trials as well as the successes. Camera trap distance sampling. My final PhD student developed this, published just a few years ago, and it's rapidly taken off as a way to monitor a range of species, mostly in rainforest, but other environments too. And that allows you to apply camera trap data when you can't individually identify animals. Where if you can individually identify animals, you use capture-recapture. Acoustic surveys, where instead of having an observer at a point or a camera at a point, you have a microphone array at a point. An array so that you can triangulate to get distances. And 3D surveys, not a major method, but becoming used for acoustic fish surveys, for sonar fish surveys, for radar bird surveys, migrating birds, and some acoustic surveys. What time have I got left? Okay, so one more, distance sampling experiments, for example, before-after control impact, where you want to look at the impact of, say, a controlled burn on numbers of birds. Oh, and model-based distance sampling. Increasingly, we're developing models. I put in a lot of stuff here that I knew I wouldn't get through, but I can make the talk available to anyone who wants it. But I'll just briefly say something about something controversial. Sighting surveys from aircraft or ship. I think these will be soon consigned to history. And those of us who have spent a lot of our lives developing methods for that might feel a bit aggrieved about that. But there are various problems, for example, of observers recording animals from aircraft, partly because you can't sling an observer underneath the aircraft. No such safety concerns for cameras, and so you can run camera surveys. You get verifiable data on record because you've got the images. With high-resolution images, the aircraft can fly really high to avoid disturbance. Because it's really high, there's no fall-off in detectability across the strip. And no issue of poor visibility below the aircraft. And observer safety isn't put at risk. What about the pilot? Well, drones. This is the sort of almost toy drone that people think of when you talk about drone surveys. You need to think a bit more than that. If it's going to replace large-scale surveys, you don't want something more like that. And Turkey now produces drones, military drones, that are not that expensive, which is why Ukraine has lots of them. African countries are buying them up rapidly. And the technology is always advancing, and the ultimate drone is one of those. And there are surveys done from satellite imagery these days. And that introduces new issues, which I'll skate over, but I can make the talk available to anyone who wants to, and I'll summarize. Eventually. I said there was a lot of stuff I wasn't going to use here. finally. So I think large-scale sighting surveys by aircraft or ship are likely to be replaced in the very near future by drone surveys and high-resolution imagery. That brings up new issues for the statistician to solve. The statistician really needs to be interacting with the developer of technology these days. I think many line and point transit surveys conducted at ground level are likely to be replaced by point designs with camera traps or acoustic arrays deployed at points. So I think point transit will become the dominant form of distance sampling in the future. There'll be more variations and methods to allow surveying of a wider range of animal populations. So statistical ecology is changing through both evolution and revolution in response to new technologies. These provide opportunities for statisticians to have real impact, but the downside of that is the unprecedented rate of technological change could leave us in backwaters. I mean, I've created a career out of distance sampling. I don't think there's much future in that career in the form of distance sampling I developed. Okay, I'll finish there.
With all these new approaches coming out, how are we going to maintain the rigor in terms of analyzing the data? Yeah.
I think that something that David understood was the need for teams, so that if the field biologist needs to be working interactively with the statistician, with the developer of technology, you need a very effective team. And I think David gave as good an example as anyone has in building that team. I think if you try to work in isolation these days, you lose something. You lose the usefulness of your methods if you're just a statistician. You lose the rigor of the methods if you're just a field biologist. So it's crucial to have a team. That team doesn't have to be all located at the same place. So easy to have an MS Teams meeting these days. So easy to build a group without having to be physically at the same location with the same employer. But you have to create the time and create the energy to build that group.
Thank you, Steve.